Dan sat staring blankly at his computer screen, the cursor blinking at him on the empty document. It was almost like the cursor was laughing at him. Dan was a failed novelist. His dream of becoming a digital Stephen King by selling horror books online had fallen short. No one liked his ideas. Barely anyone besides his family actually purchased his novels. Highly discouraged and quickly losing his money, Dan was considering using another writing tactic. A new writing tool he had been hearing about for the last year was an AI tool that allowed you to type out to the AI a story prompt, and the AI would write a story in seconds. Although he was intrigued, Dan had refused to use this tool because he felt pride in originality and creativity, a skill he found not a lot of people had. He had refused to resort to laziness, but originality hadn't been doing him any favors, and Dan was running out of options. Enough was enough. Dan quickly sat up and dragged his mouse to his Google tab. He types in the search bar, Chat GPT, the software that could write stories. He creates an account, and then he's in. Dan plainly types to the AI, write a horror novel. Dan sits back, thinking it might take a while even for a computer to write an entire novel. The AI begins writing and is finished in under a minute. Unfortunately, however, the AI didn't write the whole story, but rather a few chapters, followed by short chapter summaries, and the amount of chapters amounted to that of a short story. This was more than enough for Dan, though, who could use these summaries and build off of them. Perhaps he could build a novel of different short stories. As these ideas came rushing into his head, Dan started to think of specific topics the AI could write about. Dan was already impressed with this new writing tactic. This was more than he thought the AI could do. Excitement was building inside of him, until his stomach dropped when he read the title of Chapter 1. Dan makes a friend. The AI couldn't possibly know his name, Dan thought. This was just a website on a safe part of the internet, not like a site from the dark web. But the AI could have just gotten his name from when he created his account. After all, his username had Dan in it. Relief filled Dan. But just as soon as it came, it was gone, when he moved on to read the chapter summary. On a quiet, lonely night, a shy intruder watches Dan, who sits at his computer completely unaware. When the intruder realizes its presence is known, it leaves. Dan's door opens and slams behind him. Horrified, Dan stands up and stares at his door. He grabs a pocket knife he keeps at his desk and calls to the door. He grabs his phone and tries to turn it on. It's dead. Frantically, he lifts up his laptop. He thinks he might be able to call 911 through FaceTime on his Mac. When Dan looks at his laptop, his eyes fall on his open Chat GPT's tab. Dan scrolls down to the last chapter. Chapter 5. The Intruder reveals itself. Dread overcomes Dan. Cautiously looking back and forth between the door and his laptop, he starts to read the summary details of Chapter 5. The door begins to creep open. Dan looks up, and in between a small slit of the door, someone watches him. For a while, both Dan and the intruder stay frozen, staring at each other. Slowly, the intruder starts creaking the door open till his whole self is revealed. What Dan sees causes his arms to go limp. His laptop hits the floor. The intruder, standing at the door, appears to look exactly like Dan, but slightly off. His eyes were slightly bigger, his head elongated. There were shadows on his face unrelated to the lighting of the room. It was as if someone morphed Dan's likeness. The intruder slowly begins to walk towards Dan. Down on the floor, on Dan's laptop, Chat GPT begins typing. The epilogue. Dan is replaced. It continues writing, but Dan's foot backs into the back of the screen, smashing it closed. The doppelganger stands motionless in Dan's room. It stares at nothing. Dan's body lies lifeless on the floor, a pool of blood forming around him. Although Dan's doppelganger looks slightly off, he just might pass as Dan. At least if he learned to talk. Perhaps people would find the stories he has to tell a little bit more interesting.